Have you ever stood at the base of the Great Pyramid of Giza, looked up at those 2.5 million blocks of stone, and felt a strange sense of cognitive dissonance? We are taught, almost from the moment we can read, a very neat, very tidy story about human history. We are told that around 4,500 years ago, during the 4th dynasty of the Old Kingdom, a king named Khufu decided to build the ultimate tomb. We are handed this narrative wrapped in a bow. The timeline is settled, the architects are known, the mystery is solved. But what if that entire story is just a comfortable illusion? What if the stones themselves are quietly screaming a completely different truth?
It is a fascinating and unsettling thought. We love our linear timelines. We love the idea that human progress is a straight line from primitive hunter-gatherers to the builders of skyscrapers. But when you actually look at the physical evidence on the Giza plateau, that neat historical timeline shatters. The mainstream narrative insists that the pyramids and the Sphinx are products of the early dynastic era. Yet, the closer you look at the artifacts, the more you realize we might be off not just by a few centuries, but potentially by tens of thousands of years.
Let's start pulling at the threads of this standard narrative because it unravels surprisingly fast. One of the most glaring contradictions sits right out in the open, currently on display at the Egyptian Museum. I am talking about the Inventory Stela. The mainstream history books confidently state that King Khafre built the Sphinx. Khafre, of course, ruled after King Khufu, but the Inventory Stela explicitly mentions that King Khufu was reviewing plans to repair and decorate the Sphinx. How on earth can a king repair a monument that, according to our textbooks, wouldn't be built until after he was dead?
It is the ultimate chronological paradox. It is exactly like finding a diary from the 1800s where someone complains about having to repair their smartphone. It makes zero logical sense. If Khufu is repairing the Sphinx, it means the Sphinx was already there, and not just newly built, but ancient enough, weathered enough, to require extensive restoration. This single piece of stone completely upends the attribution of the Sphinx to Khafre. And if the Sphinx is vastly older than the 4th dynasty, it casts a massive shadow of doubt over the dating of the pyramids right next to it.
It really does. And it forces us to ask a much broader question about the sudden explosion of technology. To build something like the Great Pyramid, you don't just need a lot of guys with ropes and copper chisels. You need absolute mastery over a terrifyingly broad spectrum of sciences. We are talking about advanced architecture, structural engineering, physics, mathematics, cosmology, and project management on a scale that would give modern logistics companies a nervous breakdown. How does a civilization in its absolute infancy, just a few dynasties in, suddenly wake up one morning and flawlessly execute a structure that we, with all our modern cranes and computers, would struggle to replicate today?
That is precisely the elephant in the room. The technological leap is too sudden. It is like watching a child go from playing with wooden blocks to designing a nuclear reactor in a single afternoon. Evolution, whether biological or cultural, leaves a trail of prototypes, a trail of mistakes, but the Great Pyramid is perfect. Furthermore, if the 4th dynasty kings were these supreme masters of engineering, why did the knowledge vanish so quickly? Some prominent Egyptologists have even admitted that the kings of the 4th dynasty seem to know very little about the pyramids themselves, or the actual mechanics of how they were constructed.
Which leads to the most damning piece of evidence of all, the absolute silence of the supposed builders. If you pull off the greatest architectural achievement in the history of the planet, you put your name on it. Yet, inside the pyramids attributed to Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure, there are no inscriptions claiming credit. More importantly, none of their mummies were ever found inside these structures. We are told these are tombs, but they are tombs devoid of bodies, devoid of eulogies, and devoid of any original ownership documents.
Exactly. And the evidence used to link these specific kings to the pyramids is incredibly flimsy when you put it under a microscope. Take the famous laborers' cemeteries discovered near Giza. The mainstream narrative jumped on this, claiming these were the brave workers who built the tombs for the pharaohs. But when you look at the inscriptions in those cemeteries, there is absolutely no direct link between those laborers and the construction of the Giza pyramids. They were buried there, yes, but what were they actually doing? We don't know.
And what about the Wadi al-Jurf Papyri? That is often touted as the smoking gun, the definitive proof of Khufu's building project.
It is a classic case of seeing what you want to see. The papyri detail the transportation of limestone, and they mention a place called Akhet Khufu, which translates to the horizon or city of Khufu. But they never explicitly state that these stones were being used to construct the Great Pyramid of Giza. They were moving stones to a district. That is a massive leap to say they were building the most complex geometric structure on Earth. It is like finding a receipt for bricks delivered to New York City and concluding the buyer must have built the Empire State Building.
That is a perfect analogy. And the deeper you dig, the more the supposed facts look like assumptions. Even Hemiunu, the man universally credited in textbooks as the architect of the Great Pyramid, has no direct inscriptions linking him to the structure or even to Khufu himself. But the craziest part of this whole house of cards has to be Khufu's cartouche, the only piece of writing inside the Great Pyramid that supposedly proves it belongs to him.
Ah, the infamous discovery by Howard Weiss in the 19th century. Weiss was desperate to find something, anything, to secure his funding and his legacy. He blasts his way into the relieving chambers above the king's chamber with gunpowder, and miraculously, he finds a cartouche painted in red ochre spelling out Khufu's name. But there is a mountain of strong evidence suggesting that this cartouche is a blatant forgery. The spelling is questionable, the grammar doesn't fit the era, and it looks suspiciously like it was copied straight out of a textbook Weiss had in his possession at the time. If you remove that one highly suspicious painted name, there is literally nothing tying the Great Pyramid to the 4th dynasty.
Meanwhile, we are ignoring the artifacts that actually were found in and around the pyramids. They found mummies of kings from the 1st and 2nd dynasties in a cemetery right beside the Giza pyramids. They found artifacts attributed to the 2nd dynasty inside the pyramids themselves. They even found pottery inside the Giza pyramids that dates back to the Predynastic era. Why is the mainstream narrative ignoring the older artifacts to force a timeline that doesn't fit?
Because accepting the older artifacts means rewriting human history. It means accepting that an incredibly advanced ancient Egyptian civilization existed in the pre-dynastic era. Mainstream history looks at everything before 3100 BC and waves it away as prehistoric Egypt, a time of simple farmers and mud huts. But the physical evidence, the sheer scale of the Giza complex, suggests that the true golden age of Egypt, the era of the pyramids, the Sphinx, the massive obelisks, happened long before the 1st dynasty.
Which brings us to a concept that is both thrilling and slightly terrifying. Historians from antiquity, like Manathon and Diodorus Siculus, didn't date the Egyptian civilization to 3100 BC. They dated it back to roughly 36,000 BC. That is a staggering expanse of time. That places the origins of this civilization in the depths of the last ice age.
It completely alters our understanding of human survival and ingenuity. And there is a document that actually supports this deep time perspective, the Turin Papyrus. It is a highly significant document from the 19th dynasty, around 1200 BC, but it was copied from much, much older sources. It is essentially a comprehensive king list. It has 11 columns detailing the rulers of Egypt. But the most fascinating part is the first column, which lists the rulers of the predynastic era.
Right. And mainstream historians usually dismiss this first column as pure mythology because it lists a group known as the NTRS, which we translate as gods.
Precisely. Modern scholars look at that and say, well, they are just listing their mythological deities before the real human kings begin. But the Turin Papyrus doesn't treat them as abstract spirits in the sky. It treats them as flesh and blood rulers. Line 12 of the first column explicitly says, the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, Ra. It gives Ra a terrestrial political title. This suggests that the gods of the dynastic era were actually the deified kings of a forgotten, highly advanced pre-dynastic civilization.
That makes so much sense when you think about how human memory works over millennia. If a civilization is wiped out, or if thousands of years pass, the extraordinary people of the past, the master builders, the great leaders, slowly transition from history to legend, and finally to myth. We turn our ancestors into gods because we have forgotten how to be as great as they were.
That is a profound way to look at it. The dynastic Egyptians weren't inventing a pantheon out of thin air. They were remembering their own distant past. They were looking at the colossal ruins of the Giza plateau and revering the people who built them as divine, simply because the technology and the capability to build such things had been completely lost to time.
But this brings up a massive, unavoidable question. If the ancient Egyptians of the Predynastic era built the most mathematically precise structures on the planet, if they had this supreme grasp of logistics and engineering, why didn't they write it down? Where are the blueprints? Where are the papyri detailing the construction? If they are the true originators of this greatness, why is there no written documentation of their achievements?
It is the ultimate paradox, isn't it? We equate intelligence and advancement with the written word, but the short, mind-bending answer is that this civilization existed before humanity invented writing as we understand it.
Wait, you are telling me they mapped the stars, aligned millions of tons of stone to true north with terrifying precision, and managed a workforce of thousands, all without writing a single word down? How is that even possible?
It forces us to redefine what an advanced civilization looks like. We assume that writing is a prerequisite for complex thought and monumental engineering. But what if it isn't? What if they simply didn't need to write? Think about a master musician who can compose a symphony in their head without ever writing a note of sheet music. Or consider cultures with highly developed oral traditions, where vast amounts of data, genealogy, and spatial mapping are stored entirely in human memory.
So, you are suggesting their brains were fundamentally trained differently, that they possessed a capacity for spatial reasoning and memory that we have lost because we outsourced our memory to paper and now to hard drives?
Exactly. Writing is, in a way, a crutch. It is an external hard drive for a brain that no longer wants to hold the information. A civilization operating at the peak of its mental and spiritual capacity might not need to jot things down on a piece of papyrus. Furthermore, they might have documented their legacy in a medium we simply haven't recognized yet. We are looking for text, for phonetic symbols. But what if the mathematics embedded in the proportions of the Great Pyramid is the text? What if the geometry of the Giza plateau is a language written in solid stone, designed to survive a global cataclysm that paper and digital servers could never survive?
That is a chilling thought. We are walking around these monuments looking for a user manual, not realizing that the monument itself is the manual. We just forgot how to read the language of geometry and proportion. It really makes you wonder about the arrogance of modern society. We look back at the past and assume they were primitive because they didn't leave us a diary. Meanwhile, our own digital civilization could be wiped out by a single massive solar flare, leaving absolutely no trace of our existence for future archaeologists.
It is the ultimate irony. We leave behind plastic bottles and corrupted hard drives. They left behind artificial mountains that track the precession of the equinoxes. When you look at the evidence, the Inventory Stela proving the Sphinx is older than Khafre, the lack of mummies, the forged cartouche, the pre-dynastic artifacts found inside the pyramids, and the explicit records of the Turin Papyrus, the conclusion becomes almost undeniable. The dynastic Egyptians were not the builders. They were the inheritors. They were the survivors who occupied the ruins of a golden age they could barely comprehend.
It completely changes how you view human history. It means progress isn't a straight line upward. It is cyclical. We rise to incredible heights, we achieve things that defy imagination, and then, for reasons we still don't fully understand, we fall. We forget. And then we slowly climb back up, finding the ruins of our former selves and calling them the work of gods.
Which should make us look at our current technological peak with a deep sense of humility. The stones of Giza are not just a tomb for a forgotten king. They are a mirror reflecting our own fragility. They are a warning that knowledge, no matter how profound, can be lost.
The next time you see a picture of the pyramids, or if you are lucky enough to stand in their shadow, don't just ask how they were built, ask when. Ask who we really are, and how much of our own story we have forgotten. The answers might just rewrite everything we thought we knew about the human journey.